was never a party man. In fact, most of the neighbors of the neighborhood considered him an eccentric figure, a man who lived alone in the house at the end of the street, always with the curtain closed and the door locked. He was the kind of person who hid in his own thoughts, away from any social interaction. For him, the silence of his home was a comfort. He never cared to have friends. He never felt the lack of conversations with others. But that year, something had changed. Perhaps it was the growing loneliness or the passage of time that made him reflect more on life. Henry spent weeks planning a big party, something he never imagined doing. He decided that he would invite all the neighbors to a celebration, a way to leave behind loneliness and take a step towards something new, something he had not even known to name. He spent days preparing the house. The colored lights were carefully placed, adorning the garden and the facade of the house. Banners and balloons, which did not look anything like the usual decoration of Henry, were scattered inside. The tables were full of appetizers, and the soft music that was heard in the early hours of the night seemed to promise a warm and welcoming party. When the sun began to set, the first figures appeared in the street. The neighbors, somewhat suspicious but curious, began to approach the house. There was always a certain fear of entering the property of Henry, but that night, what kept them away seemed to be overcome by a silent expectation. The door was open as an invitation to the new. Some timid smiles spread through the group that arrived, greeting with nods and cautious words. The environment was loaded with something that Henry could not identify, a mixture of relief and nervousness. He was not good at socializing, but wanted to try. I wanted to see others having fun, listening to laughter and conversations. He felt somehow part of something bigger, a wave of interaction that was beyond his control. During the first few minutes, everything seemed perfect. People gathered, laughed, drank, and gradually the air of discomfort was dissipating. However, something was happening. The moment the lights of the house started flashing, no one noticed immediately. It was a simple electrical failure, they thought. But soon the lights started flashing more often, and at some point they didn't stop anymore. A strange sensation hovered in the air, a tension that no one knew where it came from. The conversations began to diminish. The laughter became more forced. Henry, although he tried to look calm, he also felt it, a growing pressure, as if something was about to happen. It was when a door at the back of the house, which was open, closed suddenly. There was no one near her, and then another. The doors began to lock themselves one by one. The mood was no longer the same. The group of guests, who initially mixed easily, now began to move away from each other with looks of curiosity and mistrust. Something strange was going on, but what was it? A fault in the house or something more sinister? Not knowing exactly what to do, the guests tried to ignore the growing feeling of discomfort. The music still played, but now it seemed more distant, as if it came from a different place. A feeling of claustrophobia spread, but no one knew what was about to happen. The party was just beginning, but something wasn't right. And it was when a muffled scream came from somewhere in the house. The first disappearance happened. The cry was muffled, but still it cut through the silence of the house with a distressing clarity. The guests looked at each other, tense, but no one dared to move immediately. The party, which before seemed a moment of relaxation, now turned into something more dark. Henry, who was standing near the drink table, took a hesitant step, his eyes fixed on the shadows that seemed to grow inside the house. "It was just a scare. It must have been a joke," said one of the neighbors, a middle-aged man named Greg. But his voice was shrouded, and the concern was visible in his eyes. Yet no one moved. None of us knew if the scream was real or if it was just a glitch in the already strange environment around us. As if the space itself was beginning to distort. The doors, which used to close by themselves, now seemed to lock with a dry snap, as if someone was inside, manipulating the locks. We tried to leave, but the front door was impossibly locked. The other exits didn't make sense. Some disappeared, as if they had never existed. The place began to become a maze. In a rush, we tried to go back to the living room, where the music was still playing, but with a muffled sound, distant. There we came across something even more disturbing. One of the people who had arrived earlier, Martha, had disappeared. No one remembered seeing her leaving. There were no clues. She was nowhere. "I saw her just there," said a nervous woman, pointing to the dark corridor leading to the back of the house. The fear spread quickly, without anyone needing to say a word. We began to walk hastily around the house, calling the name of Martha, but the only answer was the echo of our voices. The house seemed to swallow every sound we made, distorting it until it became unrecognizable. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Something or someone was there, watching us, and with each step the pressure increased. In a moment of collective panic, we began to run for the exit, but we came across an invisible wall, as if the house itself had closed over us. The doors were locked, and there was no way out. The air became denser, as if something was pressing against our breasts. Panic took hold, and while some tried to force the doors or break the windows, others began to disappear. Gradually, without even realizing it, we were getting more and more apart from each other. "Henry!" cried Greg, but Henry didn't answer. He was standing still with an empty look. The lights were flashing faster and faster, and the sound of the music was completely distorted, as if it were just a distant noise. It was then that the truth became clear. Those who disappeared were not going anywhere else. They were being consumed. An invisible and evil presence was hunting each of us, and the more we tried to resist, the more the house became a relentless nightmare, as if the walls had life of their own, closing around us and separating us from each other. The worst, however, was to come. As I looked up at the stairs leading to the second floor, I saw a shadow moving. A face appeared on the ladder, but it was not of a person. It was not human. It was a distorted thing, without expression, a dark mass that crawled down the stairs, becoming denser as it approached. The panic was total. Running aimlessly, we tried to escape through the house, but the doors are locked even more, and the lights went out completely. Only the sound of steps echoed through the corridors, as if they were surrounding us. When someone started to cry for help, the sound soon disappeared, as if the house was swallowing everything. We were being consumed by the house itself, and Henry, in his frightening calm, seemed to be ahead of it all. He didn't seem surprised, as if he knew what was happening all along. He had drawn us into that nightmare. Now all that was left was the struggle for survival. The house was in complete chaos. The sound of our hasty steps mixed with the noise of locked doors alone, the thud of broken glass and desperate screams echoing through the corridors. Each corridor seemed to lead to a dead end. Each room was even more isolated, and the feeling that something was watching us became overwhelming. The time seemed distorted. We didn't know how long it had been since the first disappearance, but with each passing second, the house seemed to become more oppressive. The lights, which before blinked, were now out, and the darkness was almost palpable. Every movement we made seemed to be amplified. The noises around us became more strange, more distorted, as if something or someone was manipulating the reality around us. We tried to get together, find a way to escape, but the house had its own will. Fear was written on everyone's faces, and the attempts to escape seemed more like a race against the inevitable. I tried to call the others, but my voice was lost in the vast darkness. When we finally managed to gather in the living room, something even more disturbing happened. The music, which was once muffled, returned in a deafening way, playing a distorted melody, as if being played by invisible hands. And then Henry. He was standing in the corner of the room, looking at us with an empty smile on his face. His eyes were wide, as if in a trance, but at the same time, there was something else there, something that was not human. He was different, but no one could tell how. "You shouldn't have come," he said with a cool calm, as if he was just noting a simple fact. I warned them, but they didn't want to hear. But Henry's words were in vain. The house, which seemed to have a life of its own, began to move. The ground was shaking under our feet. The walls were bending in impossible ways, creating new doors and corridors. The stairs began to writhe, as if they were made of rubber, twisting at impossible angles. The ceiling seemed to sink and expand, as if it was about to collapse on us. Something was feeding on our energy, our anxiety, our sense of impotence. Suddenly, a new wave of screaming cut the air. Greg had disappeared. When we last saw him, he was trying to open a door in the next room. Now he wasn't there anymore. There was no trace of him, only the echo of his cries, which dissipated as quickly as they began. Panic took over everyone. We knew we were not alone at home, but whatever was chasing us wasn't a person. It was a presence, an evil force that had fed on our energy and now was in search of more. Henry seemed to be immune to all this. He moved calmly, his eyes fixed on something that others could not see. He knew what was happening, and then something even more terrible came out. The house, in its distortion, began to form figures of shadows, figures of familiar faces, of people who had already disappeared. Martha, Greg, others. They were all there, but it wasn't them anymore. They were only specters, distorted figures moving around the room, looking at us with empty eyes, as if they were trapped in that house, forced to repeat an eternal cycle. The truth was finally clear. We were not being hunted by a supernatural force alone. We were being captured, our energy drained to feed the house. A house that should never have been built. A house with a dark past, full of secrets buried in its foundations. Henry had apparently made a pact, an exchange, and he was just fulfilling his role. He wasn't stuck like us. He had been chosen. With a final scream, we tried to run into the basement, the only way out that seemed to remain. But as we approached, the ladder collapsed, and all we could hear was the muffled sound of our own hearts beating in the darkness. The weight of the house crushed us. We were being consumed, one by one, as if we were part of the decoration of a nightmare that would never end. Henry looked at us for the last time. His eyes were empty, but there was a gleam of satisfaction there. He had succeeded. The darkness was total. No light, no sound beyond the frenetic rhythm of our breaths. What remained of the feast was a silent nightmare, a house that had become an immortal prison, devouring everything that dared to approach. The air was thick, soaked with the smell of despair and decay. There were no more corridors, no more stairs. All that was there was the growing emptiness of the house, a house that seemed to feed on our anguish. When I realized that we were really alone, or maybe we had never been so far from what we already knew, the sound of the steps echoed again. But this time they were not ours. They were not of the disappeared. They were the steps of something that was not human. Something that did not belong to that space but was there, waiting. A distorted being, which crawled in the shadows of the house, feeding on our energy. I, now without strength and with others around me, finally understood the truth. The house was not just a prison for those who entered. It was a place of transformation, of mutation, where the souls were captured and used, so that the house could continue its distorted existence. Each missing person was now immersed in some kind of endless loop, without body but also without death. As the darkness swallowed us, I saw Henry once again standing in the center of the room, completely calm. He will become part of the house, an extension of it, a fundamental piece that now controlled the reality that imprisoned us. His empty smile was the last thing I saw before everything fell apart. Then the house shut up. Time is suspended. There were no more screams. There was no more fighting. Only absolute silence. When finally the weight of the shadows rose, and the sounds returned, the house seemed unchanged. No mark of destruction, no sign of what had happened. The walls were intact. The smell of a party still hovers in the air, as if the moments of terror had never happened. And that's how Henry appeared to the new guests. The next day, the neighborhood did not talk about the party. The lights in Henry's house were off, but people still walked by the street as if nothing had happened. And no matter how hard people tried, they didn't remember who had been there that night. None of them remembered who Henry really was or what he had done. The house remained empty but full of an invisible burden. And as the sun set, those still alive wondered why they felt an inexplicable cold in their hearts, as if, somewhere deep, a distorted memory was watching them, the memory of a night that would never end. The Green Oaks condo was, at first glance, like any other. Built in the 70s, with its wide corridors and the characteristic smell of mold that infiltrated through the cracks of the doors. The place seemed a reflection of its own decay. The already worn walls and the elevator that creaked every time I went up made it a little less inviting. But still, it was the kind of place where ordinary people came to live, hoping that the silence and the routine of day-to-day life could muffle the worries they brought from outside. Mark, a new resident, had moved to the third floor a few weeks earlier. Young, 28 years old, newly divorced and looking for a new start, he saw in Green Oaks an affordable option. His new life began there, among unknown neighbors and walls with silent stories. However, since he arrived, something strange seemed to hover over that floor. Floor 3 was different. It was as if the atmosphere had a subtle weight, a sense of restlessness that nobody seemed to want to discuss. The neighbors, always polite, rarely spoke more than necessary. When they greeted each other, they did so almost mechanically, as if they were only fulfilling a social protocol. At first, Marcos did not pay much attention, but soon noticed something more disturbing: the disappearances. In the early days, he noticed that some doors were closed, but the villagers never left. Curious, asked the Manuel, the resident of apartment 304, about the subject. People come and go. Nothing more, was all that Manuel replied, his look empty and distant. But as time went on, the number of disappearances began to increase. 1, 2, 3 residents who simply did not return. The order did not provide explanations. The manager, a man with a closed countenance, rarely gave interviews, and when he did, his eyes turned to the ground, as if looking for something he did not want to find. But what bothered Mark was the apartment 309. The apartment, which nobody saw being occupied, seemed to hide an aura of mystery. Although the door was always locked, what you heard inside was even stranger. During the night, from time to time, the window of number 309 seemed to light up, and Mark has heard indistinct voices and footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Sometimes a murmur, sometimes a muted laugh, as if a party was going on inside. But however, no one ever saw anyone enter or leave. One day, after a particularly cold night, Marcos decided to ask about the apartment. He approached Teresa, the lady who lived in 308, a woman who seemed to know everything about everyone. "Have I ever seen anyone enter or exit 309? Asked Mark, trying to hide his growing curiosity. Teresa looked at him with her eyes wide open, and in a low tone, as if she feared being heard, answered, "That apartment is cursed, my son. Better stay away. They say that who enters there never comes back." Mark smiled, disconcerted. These are just rumors, he thought to himself, but the words of Teresa began to hover in his mind, like a shadow that could not get away. When night fell again, the usual routine of the condo seemed to take its place. But Mark could not get the idea of apartment 309 out of his head. He had heard the sounds, seen the lights, but could not understand what was happening there. As much as I tried to ignore it, the feeling that something was profoundly wrong with that apartment only increased. It was a night like any other when the first disappearance happened. And this time, Mark was not willing to ignore. He felt that something else was behind it all, something he needed to find out. The following days passed like a blur, with Mark trying to concentrate on his daily life. However, the echo of voices and footsteps he heard on the third floor began to intensify. During the day, everything seemed normal, but at night, the silence of the condominium was broken by unusual sounds. Low murmurs, muffled laughter, as if there was something going on in 309 that nobody could see. Mark could no longer ignore. It was as if something inside him pulled him into that apartment, like a magnet, a growing sense that he needed to find out what was going on. He began to ask the residents discreet questions, trying to gather information, but no one seemed willing to speak openly about 309. The answers were evasive, uncomfortable, as if everyone there knew more than they were willing to say. It was then that Marcos approached Gilberto, a resident who lived in 311, a man already of middle age, with a tired look and a posture that suggested he had seen more than he wanted. Gilberto was always sitting in the entrance of his apartment, smoking his cigarette, and seemed to be a good source of information. When Mark approached him, he made an expression that mixed tiredness with fear. "What do you know about 309? Marcos asked, trying to be casual, but his voice betrayed anxiety. Gilberto looked to the sides, as if he wanted to ensure that no one was listening. After a long sigh, he said, "Lo, I haven't talked to anyone about it, but I've lost count of how many residents have disappeared after living there. It happened with Dona Elda, with Joao, even with Carla, and now with the family in front. Nobody knows what happens, but after they move there, everything changes. They disappear. They just disappear." Mark felt a shiver run through his spine. Gilberto seemed to know something more, but hesitated to speak. He pressed, "But you never saw anyone there? Nobody comes in or leaves?" Gilberto took a long gulp of the cigarette, and for a moment, the silence between them extended, charged with an increasing tension. Finally, he said in the lowest voice, "Heard things, strange things. Sometimes during the night, it's like someone is inside, banging on the walls, as if they're trying to get out. But nobody ever sees them. And the worst is that it seems that once they enter that apartment, there is no way out. No one came back to tell what happens there." Mark felt a lump in his throat. He did not know what to think anymore. Gilberto's words had increased the feeling of discomfort, but his curiosity was stronger. He could no longer convince himself that it was all just rumors. That night, something inside him changed. Marcos decided that he needed to go to apartment 309. He needed to see with his own eyes what was happening. He waited for the moment when the floor was quieter, when most of the residents were already home, and then, with his heart beating fast, took the elevator. When I arrived on the third floor, the corridor was immersed in shadows. The sound of the steps themselves seemed amplified, resonating on the walls as if the corridor was longer than it really was. He walked down the hall and stopped at the door of room 309. The handle was cold to the touch. From where he stood, he could hear the footsteps. Or were they just echoes of his mind? It was impossible to say. With a deep sigh, Mark turned the handle. The door opened with a low creak, as if it had been opened many times before. The interior of the apartment was dark, but still he could distinguish the outline of old and dusty furniture, with torn fabrics and a musty smell in the air. The street light filtered through the dirty curtains, but it was not enough to illuminate the space in a full way. Mark took a step forward, feeling an increasing pressure on his chest. Something was pushing him inside, as if the apartment was calling for him. He took another step, then another, until he was completely inside. Then the sound began. Voices, weak but distinct. It was as if several people were talking somewhere far from the apartment, but he did not see anyone. It was a mixture of murmuring, low laughter, and a conversation that made no sense. He went on, his feet dragging on the dirty carpet. The footsteps he had heard the night before seemed closer now, more real. A feeling of dread began to take him. As he approached a closed door, the sound of voices and steps suddenly ceased. An absolute silence took the place, and then something more. A cold and heavy sigh coming from inside the room. Mark hesitated, but the door opened on its own, as if inviting him in. He knew he could not turn back. Whatever was going on there, he needed to find out. Fear and curiosity mixed, and with a last look at the empty corridor, he entered. And then he saw something that would make his mind doubt everything he knew. The door closed behind Mark with a muffled sound, as if apartment 309 was sealing its fate. He blinked, trying to adjust his eyes to the darkness, but even in the dark something stood out. A figure standing quietly in the center of the room. The figure was indistinct, a shadow that seemed to float slightly above the ground. The air was heavy, as if the presence of something or someone made the space denser, more oppressive. Mark felt his heart racing, but his feet did not move. The figure, though vague, seemed to be waiting. "Who's there?" Mark finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse from the tension. The answer was a low and almost inhuman laugh, coming from somewhere within the figure. She did not move, but the sound seemed to emanate from her, echoing throughout the room, reverberating on the walls. The laughter was followed by a deep, almost satisfied sigh, as if the presence knew that he was there, that he had been drawn to this moment. Mark took a step back, but the air seemed thick, as if it was becoming harder to breathe with every movement he tried to make. He looked around and noticed something else. The walls were covered with marks, indelible inscriptions, as if someone had tried to write something beyond human comprehension. But that was not all. The strangest, most disturbing, were the doors that were open inside the apartment, all of them leading into a void, as if they were just entrances to other realities or dimensions that could not be touched, seen, or understood. Then he heard a familiar sound. Steps. Quick steps, as if someone was coming towards him. But he didn't see anyone. The sound approached, more and more loud, and suddenly something passed by him, rubbing to his side with an intensity that made his body shiver from pain. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense. The voices returned, now clearer, sharper. It was as if a crowd of people were simultaneously speaking in a tone of despair, their words overlapping each other, but none of them being heard completely. He tried to scream, but his voice did not come out, as if being swallowed by the very atmosphere of the place. Mark tried to run, but the doors were closing in front of him, one after another, as if the apartment was swallowing him up, causing him to become more and more trapped. He heard the sound of repeated beats, as if someone was trying to escape from inside one of the walls. But he could not see anything, nothing but shadows that distorted and moved in ways impossible to understand. The feeling of being observed took him completely. Something was behind him, something with empty eyes, with a dense presence that seemed to crawl up the walls and down the floor. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. What he felt was a ghostly presence, almost liquid, running through the cracks, covering him, enveloping him. Then one of the doors opened completely. Mark was paralyzed, feeling an invisible force pulling him toward it. The door was the only way out now, but as he went through it, he did not know if he would be escaping or walking to something even more terrible. He stepped forward, but when his feet touched the floor of the new room, he felt a sudden fall, as if the space itself were being distorted. The air became colder, the light weaker. He felt trapped in a layer of distorted reality where time seemed to crumble around him. The voices now were desperate cries, coming from every direction, but without origin. It was as if the missing residents, the souls who had lost themselves inside 309, were talking to him, trying to alert him. Then, in the corner of the room, he saw something that made him swallow dry. A human figure, or what was left of one, lay on the ground, covered by a layer of dust and dirt. The body was distorted. Its bones seemed broken in places where the body should not bend. But there was something else. A strange glow coming from his empty eyes. Mark barely had time to react when the figure stood up abruptly. His bones cracked as if he was reassembling, as if that presence was rebuilding itself there before him, ready to be freed. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, but not in a human way. Your voice was distorted, broken, as if you were speaking through a veil of pain and suffering. "Now you are also part of us." Mark tried to back down, but his feet were heavy, as if the ground was absorbing him. He screamed, but his screams blended with the others, as if all the missing villagers were trying to warn him, but he could no longer hear them. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who he was anymore. Before he could react, the figure advanced, and the shadows swallowed him. When Mark woke up, the sun was shining shy through the curtains of apartment 309. His head was heavy, as if it had been crushed by something invisible. He was lying on the ground, his body stiff, covered by a layer of dust that he did not remember having seen before. The environment around him seemed the same, but at the same time, something was different. The feeling of oppression had disappeared, but there was a void, a deep silence that made everything more unbearable. He rose slowly, feeling every muscle of his body protest. The air was lighter, but the smell of mold and decomposition was still present, as if the apartment was alive, breathing with it, waiting for something. But the strangest thing was that when he looked around, nothing seemed out of place. There was no more the distorted figure he saw before, nor the voices echoing on the walls. 309 was somehow calm, as if he was just waiting. Mark looked at the door. Those same doors, those same inscriptions on the walls were still there. But now he knew that was more than just an apartment, more than a place. It was a portal, a point of rupture between worlds, between those who had lost themselves and those who were still trying to escape. He walked slowly toward the door and, touching the handle, felt something. A cold, icy touch coming from the other side. He stopped, hesitated, and then opened. The corridor was empty, but the feeling that someone or something was watching him was unmistakable. Mark passed through the door and entered the silent corridor. The sound of his footsteps now seemed an aggression to the silence of that place. What awaited him on the other side, he did not know. He still did not understand how or why it was there. But a sense of urgency pushed him to go on, to get out of that building and try to understand what had happened to him, what had happened to all the others who had disappeared. He went down the stairs of the building in quick steps, but when he reached the front door, something stopped him. In the reflection of the glass door, he saw something that made him freeze. A shadow moving behind him with a distorted and indistinct shape. He turned quickly, but there was nothing, only silence. Mark felt a wave of panic, but something prevented him from opening the door. He knew somehow that he could not leave. Something still held him there, like an invisible anchor. He turned again, feeling the eyes of the shadows on him. There was no escape. What he felt, what surrounded him, was beyond his control. Before he could react, the voice came again. But now it was no longer distorted. It was clear, direct, as if he had heard it 1,000 times in his mind. "You'll never get out of here, Marcos." Mark took a step back, feeling the presence approaching, the air becoming denser. He closed his eyes, trying to block the sound, the sight, the fear. But there was no escape. What he didn't know was that he had already become part of the 309 story, part of a long line of lost souls who would never be forgotten. At that moment, the silence of the building was broken definitively. The voices, laughter, screams, everything was mixed in a single muffled sound, coming from within the apartment itself. The 309 swallowed, and now he was doomed to be part of his history, another victim of what should never have been touched. The door of the building closed behind Mark, and he disappeared forever. But if anyone passed by, they could hear, during the night, the sound of footsteps coming from the 3rd floor, the echo of voices of old residents, and the unmistakable feeling that apartment 309 was still waiting for another victim, another lost soul. And the cycle would repeat. It was a sunny autumn morning when the new family arrived in the neighborhood. The change was quick and discreet, but soon their faces began to appear between fences and doors, greeting the neighbors with warm smiles and friendly nods. They were everything the neighborhood needed to keep its image quiet and welcoming. The couple, Matthew and Emily, with their 2 young children, Lucas and Sophie, quickly became the center of attention, being invited to weekend barbecues and never failing to show a contagious sympathy. The neighbor, Samuel, who lived in a house at the end of the street, watched everything with an attentive and somewhat skeptical look. Samuel was an introverted man, over 50 years old, and a long career as archivist for a local company. He was always the kind of person who noticed the small details, the minute variations in the behavior of people around him, especially when it came to new residents. The first thing that caught his attention was their perfection. It was like the family had come out of a catalog of interior decoration. The house always spotless, the children seemed too well behaved for their age, and the parents, always smiling, never seemed tired and overwhelmed with the demands of life. It was strange, but nothing until that moment made him suspect anything else. That's when he started noticing little details that didn't fit. They never talked about the past. Or better said, whenever the subject came up, Matthew or Emily quickly changed the topic. When he tried to ask more about the city they came from, Emily smiled nervously and said that they had moved around a lot over the years, with no deep roots anywhere. "Life takes us where we need to go," she said, as if it were a rehearsed phrase. Samuel did not like people who avoided direct answers. He had learned, throughout his life, that whoever hides something usually has much more to fear than those who are simple and transparent. The first days passed, and the behavior of the new family seemed increasingly impeccable. Matthew and Emily continued to be the ideal neighbors, always ready to help with a smile on their faces. Lucas and Sophie, the children, were polite and almost never caused problems. Samuel watched them more often from his window, noting that the children never played like other children in the neighborhood. There was no mess, loud laughter, or lively conversations, as was common in most homes with small children. They seemed to be ghostly beings, always so quiet, so controlled. Even at school, Samuel had known through another neighbor, they had a curious behavior, not to get acquainted with the other children, as if they were apart on the edge of everything. One day, Samuel was in the garden when he saw Matthew and Emily talking to Mrs. Jenkins, who lived 2 houses down. The subject seemed to be an exchange of kindness, but the conversation soon became strange to Samuel. He could hear fragments of phrases like, "We lived in so many cities," and "the problems with the change never end." The way Emily looked away while she spoke and Matthew's forced smile did not go unnoticed by Samuel. There was something in that couple that did not match the perfect image that everyone wanted to believe. Their smile seemed almost mechanical, as if they were playing a role that had already been memorized long ago. That same night, Samuel decided to follow an impulse that bothered him. He had a cup of strong coffee and, unnoticed, began to walk down the street. The house of the new family was lit, and the curtains were always closed. It was not something he had noticed before, but that night the vision bothered him. When he approached, he saw the shadow of an adult figure walking from one side to the other through the window of the room. The movement was fast and nervous, as if someone was agitated, trying to avoid being seen. He stopped, not knowing exactly what to do. Their behavior was beginning to take his sleep away, and I could no longer ignore the feeling that there was something more there, something the other neighbors seemed not to notice. In the distance, he saw Emily leaving quickly for the car, alone, in the middle of the morning, with an expression that he could not decipher. She seemed to be in a hurry, but at the same time hesitant. The next morning, Samuel decided to look for more information. He went to the local library and, with his experience as an archivist, began looking for old records about the family. It was strange as there were virtually no documents about them. No mention in local newspapers, no record of previous residents. Everything he found seemed to have been carefully erased. This could not be a coincidence. It was then that, when looking at some files, he found an old photo, half dusty, of a couple with 2 children. The photo was in an unnamed folder, and the date was almost 15 years ago. The family looked familiar, but Samuel could not remember seeing them before. But there was something peculiar. In the man's eyes in the photo, there was a coldness that made Samuel's stomach turn. He knew he was approaching something dangerous, but could not stop. The restlessness already takes over his mind. The night was especially hot when Samuel decided he could not wait any longer. He had gathered together all the fragments that he could find, and each piece only increased his restlessness. The couple, the children, the inaccurate stories, the mysterious photo, all that was consuming him. He knew something was very wrong, and though his mind tried to convince himself that perhaps he was only imagining things, his instinct told him that he was close to discovering a terrible secret. That night, Samuel watched from his living room window with the curtain slightly ajar while Matthew and Emily were talking on the balcony. The conversation seemed calm, but Samuel managed to hear scattered words that caused him a shiver. "We can't let him find out," said Emily in a low whisper. Matthew answered with an almost inaudible voice, but which Samuel managed to distinguish. "He will discover everything, and then it will be too late for all of us." Those words were enough to make Samuel's heart race. He could not stand still any longer. It was time to act. With trembling legs, he took his jacket and went out the back door. From a distance, he saw the two children of Emily and Matthew playing in the yard, as if nothing was happening. But there was something strange about the way they moved, as if they were under the control of someone or something that they could not control. Samuel looked away, feeling a shiver in his spine, and went towards their house, trying to be as discreet as possible. He crept through the shadows until he stood on the side of the house, where a basement window was slightly open. He knew that he should not do this, but curiosity and fear drove him to go ahead. He bent down and, with accelerated breathing, peeked through the opening. What you saw made him freeze completely. Inside the house, the scene was surreal. Matthew was on his knees, hands outstretched towards an old wooden box, ancestral in appearance. He was muttering words that Samuel could not understand, and around him, Emily and the children were gathered in a circle, their faces empty, as if they were in trance. Then the vision became even more disturbing. A dark shadow formed in the center of the room, growing into a human form, but his skin was as dark as night, and his eyes shone with a bright red light. Samuel felt a pressure in his chest, as if the house itself was trying to suffocate him. He quickly backed away, his heart beating so hard that it seemed to want to come out of his mouth. He ran home with heavy feet, but his eyes fixed on the window of the new family house. When he arrived at his own door, a feeling of dread paralyzed him. What he had seen was real. Those were not just ordinary neighbors. They were involved in something much more sinister, something that transcends any rational explanation. The next morning, Samuel tried to resume his investigation. He ran to the library once more, but when he got there, the librarian looked at him with a forced smile and told him that the new family's file had been removed. He felt a lump in his throat, and the pieces began to fit together. They were erasing their traces, as if they wanted no one to know about their past. But Samuel knew what he had seen, and what he knew now scared him more than anything else. The neighborhood was in danger. Samuel could not think clearly anymore. The images of what he had seen in Matthew and Emily's home were etched into his mind, and he felt a growing sense of despair. He could not simply ignore what he had discovered, but he also knew that nothing could prepare him for what came next. He tried to convince himself that he was just seeing things, that his mind had been taken by fear, but he knew deep down that it wasn't so. He had seen the impossible, and now the weight of this truth was beginning to become unbearable. In the following days, Samuel tried to talk to some of the other neighbors, but nobody seemed to care. Everyone was delighted with the family, and Matthew's and Emily's words continued to be heard in all parts of the neighborhood. Their facade was perfect, as always, and no one seemed to notice the small cracks that Samuel had noticed. When he tried to tell a neighbor closer about what he had seen, the man simply smiled and shook his head. "You must be tired, Samuel. Everyone knows you're a good man, but you can't let your imagination get the best of you." Feeling isolated, he decided to act alone. Samuel began to spend more time watching their house, and in the following nights something increasingly strange happened. The black shadow he had seen before manifested more often, as if he was waiting for something. Samuel knew the moment was coming, and he felt an increasingly oppressive presence in the air. The night he decided to confront his family once and for all, Samuel prepared as if he were going into battle. He took a small camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. He had to document what was about to happen. He didn't know what he could do to stop it, but he needed proof. As he approached the new family's house, the night was strangely silent, and the wind blew with a cold that seemed to cut the skin. Samuel peeked out of the basement window once more, his heart beating hard in his chest. What he saw made his body tremble. Inside the house, the shadowy figure was there again, but now there was something more. Matthew was standing before her, arms outstretched, as if he was calling on something even greater, older. Emily stood beside her, eyes empty, like a puppet controlled by invisible wires. Suddenly the shadow turned to the window where Samuel was. His eyes shone red, and a feeling of absolute terror took hold of him. He could not run away. The shadow was aware of his presence. Samuel took a step back, but before he could walk away, he heard the sound of footsteps coming from the entrance to the house. He turned around, and there were Matthew and Emily, standing at the door, looking at him with a sinister smile on their faces. "You shouldn't have come, Samuel," said Matthew, his voice cold and empty, as if it were someone else's. "Now you are involved in what we're doing here. We can't let you reveal what you know." Before he could react, Emily took a step forward. She held something in her hands, a dark stone with strange symbols engraved on its surface. Samuel tried to move away, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. A feeling of panic took hold of his body, but he could not move. "You saw too much," said Emily, her voice whispering and chilling. "Now you'll be part of it." What happened next was a blur. Samuel couldn't process everything. The only thing he remembered was that before he lost consciousness, he saw the shadow take an even more solid form and advance towards him. When Samuel woke up, he was back at his house. But something was different. The silence was absolute, and the air seemed heavy, as if time itself had been distorted. He looked out the window and saw the new family's house still standing, but now it seemed desolate, empty, as if it had been abandoned long ago. He ran to the library once more, hoping something had changed. There he found the old files about the family, but this time there was no trace of them. There was no memory of Matthew, Emily, Luke, or Sophie. They had never existed. The neighborhood seemed as empty as their home, and Samuel now knew there was no turning back. The house of Mrs. Evelyn Harper was the oldest on Sycamore Street, with wide windows that seemed tailor-made to watch every movement in the neighborhood. At 72 years old, Evelyn was a well-known figure in the neighborhood. Short, with gray hair always stuck in a bun, and with a sharp look that let nothing pass. Although she had a friendly air, her tendency to comment on other people's lives makes her the target of jokes and whispers among the residents. Every morning, Evelyn opened the curtains with almost military precision and sat at the window, with her cup of tea and a notebook. "It's for memory," she said when someone asked about her notes, but the truth was that Evelyn liked to record what she saw. The neighbor's routine, the postman delivering mail, children running along the sidewalks. Nothing escaped his watchful eye. At first, their reports of lights on at 3 in the morning or unknown cars parked on the street were received with sympathy. "It's just Evelyn being Evelyn," said the neighbors with a condescending smile. But in the last few weeks, his observations had become more frequent and strange. "I saw something at Mr. Grant's house last night," she told Mrs. Thompson, who lived across the street. "One morning, a man in a hat came in, but never left. And Mr. Grant wasn't even home." Mrs. Thompson just laughed. attributing the comment to Evelyn's fertile imagination. It was probably someone delivering something. Evelyn, you need a hobby. But Evelyn insisted. There's something wrong here. I know what I saw. A few days later, she began to notice more unusual things. The light of the Miller's garage blinking non-stop at night, muffled voices coming from the empty house on the corner, and shadows moving in windows where no one should be. Evelyn would tell everyone who wanted to hear, but no one seemed to take it seriously. Maybe you should rest a bit, Evelyn, the young Sam, the younger neighbor, suggested kindly as he saw her mumbling about mysterious noises. However, Evelyn was sure that something was wrong in the neighborhood. And even without believing her, the neighbors will soon realize that the attentive eyes of Mrs. Harper could be the only thing standing between them and the danger that lurked in the dead of night. In the days that followed, Evelyn's observations became more urgent. She not only wrote down the details, but began to insist on people paying more attention to the little things that happened around them. One night, she heard the siren of an ambulance in the street. It was something common, but what disturbed her was the way the light blinked, almost as if it were a sign. And then another disappearance. The first was Mr. Grant, an elderly man who lived alone in the house next to Evelyn. No one noticed anything strange until he did not show up to pick up the mail or even to greet the neighbors the next morning. The police were called, but there was no clue, and nobody seemed to care much. He must have gone out to town or visited some relative, they said. He was an old man. His disappearances were not unusual. But Evelyn knew something was wrong. She saw Grant's car parked in the garage, exactly where he always left it, and could swear she heard footsteps inside during the night. Again, no one took it seriously, until others began to disappear, one after the other, so quietly that it seemed as if the street itself was swallowing its inhabitants. First, the Miller family, whose house was down the street. The children had disappeared without a trace, and so did her husband, Tom Miller. The case was treated with skepticism. After all, no one could guarantee that people had really disappeared. It may have been a leak, or they simply decided to change their lives. But Evelyn could not get rid of the feeling that there was a connection between all the disappearances. Each had something in common. They had all been observed by her at odd moments. She knew that the neighbors considered her exaggerated, but now she was convinced that something much more sinister was happening in her neighborhood. Suddenly, his observations that previously seemed irrelevant began to make sense. The lights in the neighboring houses, the figures she saw moving at night, the silences that seemed to last longer than usual. It was not paranoia, she was sure of it. Something was being hidden. That morning, Evelyn decided to take action. She went to the Wilsons' house, a family with small children who lived 3 doors down. When she knocked on the door, the silence that received her seemed more dense than ever. When Mr. Wilson, Martha, finally answered, Evelyn watched her carefully, trying to discern any sign of something wrong. "Did you see Mr. Wilson last night?" asked Evelyn, her voice trembling with tension. Martha smiled cordially, but the look in her eyes was indicative of something she could not hide. "Yes, of course. He's just too busy at work." "Evelyn, nothing wrong here, thank you." But the lady did not leave the door, stood still, watching with a piercing look. Something strange. She could feel the air, and was more certain than ever. The houses around were being affected by something invisible and sinister. When Evelyn left, she felt watched, as if invisible eyes were fixed on her. As he walked away from the Wilsons' house, he saw a figure in the second-floor window. But when he looked again, there was no one there. Panic began to take hold of her. It was not just disappearances. There was something else, something supernatural that was beginning to spread through the houses of the street. At night, before she went to sleep, Evelyn looked out of her window once more. It was empty, silent, but for some reason, she felt a chill run through her spine. Something was about to happen, and for the first time she felt that perhaps this time her observations were indeed vital. In the following days, Evelyn could not contain herself. The feeling that something was deeply wrong consumed her. She did not know who to trust anymore, for the mistrust had settled in her breast. But she could not give up now. Her observations were more than mere coincidences. Something was manipulating the neighborhood, somehow, and she was determined to find out what it was. One night, looking out the window, Evelyn saw something that made her stop and dry. A dark silhouette, a man standing at the entrance of the Wilson house. He was motionless, like a shadow watching the street. Evelyn could hardly believe what she saw. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, something she had never seen before in the neighborhood. The figure looked strange, out of place, and most disturbing of all. He was looking directly at Evelyn's house, his eyes fixed on her, as if he knew she was watching. With her heart racing, Evelyn moved away from the window and ran to the phone. She didn't know who else to call. The police? Your neighbors? None of them would believe her. Yet she dialed the number of Sam, the young neighbor who at least seemed to care about her. Sam, it's Evelyn. I need help. There is someone at the Wilson house in front of my window. He's watching the house, standing at the door, and it's strange. I don't know what to do. Evelyn was almost panting. Calm down, Evelyn, it's okay. I'll look out the window and see if I see anything. Stay where you are. Okay? Sam replied, trying to calm her down. But before he could hang up, something happened. The figure in the Wilson house moved and disappeared. Evelyn looked out the window again, her stomach turning. The figure was gone. What did it mean? Couldn't be a coincidence. Sam, he's gone. He was there, and now... Evelyn babbled, trying to understand what she had just seen. I didn't see anything, Evelyn. It's okay, go lie down. Maybe you're... A little nervous about all this, said Sam, but his tone wasn't convincing. Evelyn realized that he was trying to calm her down, as if he did not believe what she was saying. But Evelyn could not stop now. Something inside her screamed that she should not let it go. That night, when the street finally went quiet, she decided to go to the Wilsons' house. Didn't know what I would find, but felt like I needed to see it with my own eyes. She went out the back door of her house, hiding in the shadows so that she would not be seen. He approached the Wilson house carefully, feeling the cold of the night in the air. Everything was quiet, very quiet. As she approached the second-floor window, Evelyn heard something. A breath, slow and heavy, coming from inside. It was an unmistakable sound. She bent down, trying not to make a noise, and peeked through the crack of the curtain. Inside the house, the lights were off, but the shadows seemed to move. When her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that made her freeze. The figures of the children, the Wilsons, all were there, but they were not the same. Their faces were distorted, pale, lifeless, and their hands seemed to stretch out towards something invisible, as if being pulled by something. The man with the hat appeared again, now on his back, and seemed to manipulate the shadows around. He was not a mere stranger. He was in control of something much greater. Evelyn backed up, almost skidding on the ground, and ran back home, her heart beating like never before. She didn't know what she saw, but she knew she wasn't safe there anymore. The next morning, the Wilsons' house was empty. There was no trace of the residents. The children, the parents, all had disappeared without leaving a single trace. But there was something more, something that Evelyn could not explain. She looked at the empty house one last time, and in the second-floor window she saw the reflection of a pair of eyes fixed on her. Those eyes were not human. They were inside the house, inside it. And Evelyn now knew. What was happening in that neighborhood was not paranoia, but a network of looks, and she was the next to be observed. In the following days, the Sycamore neighborhood seemed to be in a state of paralysis. The disappearance of the Wilson family was no longer a matter of gossip. It was the terror that permeated every street, every house. Evelyn, now more convinced than ever that something supernatural was happening, tried to warn the others, but fear had begun to take hold of everyone. Each was watching the other, suspicious, fearing the invisible that now hovered over them. She knew that she could no longer trust the local authorities. The police were busy, but none of the agents seemed to understand what was happening. Evelyn tried to talk to Sam again, but he seemed distant, as if he had been swallowed by a heavy silence. She looked for him in his house, but found it empty. The door was unlocked, the phone ringing without anyone to answer. The neighborhood was becoming a quiet cemetery. The same silence she had heard in the Wilson house, the same silence that now permeated all the houses. Desperate, Evelyn began walking the street at night. She no longer cared about being seen and felt that she needed to do something. Each step he took seemed heavier, more full of a presence that watched her but she could not touch. She walked to the Miller house, the last house on the street that still looked inhabited. When he arrived at the door, he heard whispers coming from inside, as if the place was being occupied by something that should not be there. "Evelyn," the voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." She came in, her heart beating. In the middle of the room, she saw a standing figure. It was the man with the hat. He was there, fixed like a shadow that materialized before her. Her eyes, those eyes she already knew so well, were fixed on her, penetrating, mesmerizing. "You were part of it, Evelyn," he said in a low, echoing voice. "You saw us. Now there's no turning back." Evelyn tried to scream, but her voice failed. The environment around her began to distort, as if reality itself was being broken. The walls of the house stretched and warped, and what once seemed like a common residence was now an endless maze. She turned to run, but the man with the hat was in front of her, as if he already knew all her movements. She tried to walk away, but the shadows around her began to move, dragging her vision as if the neighborhood itself was now turning against her. The houses, formerly familiar, were now distorted, with eyes appearing in the windows, watching her, peering from inside. Every neighbor she had known, every face she knew now seemed to be transformed, absorbed by this invisible net that stretched beyond the streets of Sycamore. Suddenly, Evelyn felt a weight on her chest, as if the shadows were swallowing it. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the growing darkness. The man with the hat approached slowly, his gaze fixed, unwavering, as if he knew that she was finished. "Didn't you notice, Evelyn? It wasn't just you who was watching us. We were looking at you all the time." That's when she understood. The network of looks was not just about watching others. It was an invisible network, fueled by vigilance, curiosity, intrusion. The look she had cast upon her neighbors, upon all the strange events that occurred, had become part of a web which now imprisoned her. She had been observed, and now was being consumed. The man in the hat stepped forward, and Evelyn felt the heat of the shadows enveloping her, taking her to a place where eyes were all that remained. When the street light finally went out, and silence came to dominate Sycamore again, no one had ever known what really happened to Mrs. Evelyn Harper. The only thing that stayed was the look of the observer and the one who is observed. And this look was now spread throughout the city, an invisible net, weaving the fate of all. In the following weeks, the neighborhood of Sycamore was found empty. The houses, still intact, were now inhabited by silences, and the residents, if they ever existed, had disappeared. However, anyone who passed by there at night would swear to see eyes blinking in the windows, as if the neighborhood was still being watched. And who looked closely really would begin to understand. They were still there. Everyone was there, somehow trapped in the net of looks that Evelyn never got bait. Willow Lane was a quiet, typical American suburb with well-kept houses, immaculate gardens, and neighbors that had known each other for years. During the day, children played on bikes on the sidewalk, and at night, The lights of the houses shone in a uniform pattern, almost choreographed. It was the kind of place where nothing really happened until the arrival of the new neighbor. The house next to the Harris family, located in the middle of the street, had been empty for months. An old building with blurred glass windows and a wooden fence that needed repairs. The residents were used to commenting on who could move there. Then, one night without warning, a moving truck parked in front of the house. There was no noise of conversation, nor the usual comings and goings of the porters. Only the sound of boxes being dragged and the light creaking door closing. The protagonist, Liam, a 19-year-old who had just returned home after his first semester at college, watched it all from the window of his room. He found it curious that no one had left to greet the new resident. However, what caught his attention was that the move ended in a matter of hours, without him having seen the face of who was settling. The next days passed in silence. No one saw the new neighbor leaving home. The curtains remained closed during the day, and at night only a faint light was visible upstairs. This behavior quickly caught the attention of other residents, who began to make assumptions. "Maybe he's a recluse," suggested Mrs. Jenkins, the old lady who lived around the corner and loved to gossip. "Or else, it's some writer who likes loneliness." In the first week after moving, the noises started. Always at night, when the street was quiet, strange noises came from the house. Slaps, scratches, something that seemed to be a chair being dragged, and on some occasions a low sound, almost like a lament. "Did you hear that yesterday?" asked Liam's younger sister Clara over breakfast. She was 16 and always more sensitive to these things. "It looked like someone crying." Liam shrugged, but could not get the noises out of his head. He was accustomed to the monotony of the street and, perhaps because of this, felt a growing curiosity in understanding what was happening. That same night, he decided to pay more attention. At midnight, leaning against his window, he heard again. First the sound of heavy steps, then something that seemed to drag across the floor. He tried to convince himself that it was only imagination, but a sudden sound, a loud thud, as if something had fallen down, made him hold his breath. As the days turned into weeks, the house next door became the main topic of conversation in Willow Lane. The residents began to avoid passing near it at night, and children, who had previously played ball on the front lawn, now crossed over to the other side of the street. But for Liam, curiosity was bigger than fear. Who was the neighbor, and what exactly happened in that house every night? He didn't know yet, but was about to get involved in something much bigger than he had imagined. Liam's curiosity quickly turned into obsession. The nights were dominated by his constant vigilance. Sitting at the window of his room with the lights out, he watched the house next door as if it were a mystery waiting to be solved. The neighbor remained invisible. No visits, no deliveries, no interaction with the outside world. However, the noises continued and seemed to intensify. Now, in addition to the sounds of footsteps and scratches, Liam could swear he heard something metallic, perhaps chains or tools being dragged. During the day, he tried to talk with other neighbors to gather more information. Ms. Jenkins said he once saw a shadow pass through the upstairs window, but when he looked again, the curtains were closed. Mr. Miller, who lived across the street, said he saw lights flashing during the early hours, but did not give much importance. It was Clara who brought you the most disturbing information. "I heard the mother talking on the phone with Mrs. Jenkins. She said she heard a scream from there the other night. A woman's scream. Do you think he's hiding someone?" The suggestion made Liam uneasy. He knew he needed to find out more. He decided to look at the house from a closer perspective. On a particularly cold night, Liam waited until everyone in his house was asleep and walked out the back door. He went through the garden in silence, feeling his heart beating against his chest. He stopped at the fence separating his house from that of his neighbor and carefully climbed. When landing on the other side, the environment seemed colder, as if the house itself emanated a strange energy. In the backyard, the bush was high, which was not surprising, since the new resident did not seem to care about maintenance. Liam walked slowly, eyes fixed on the kitchen window where a dim light flickered. Then he saw something. On the floor near the back door, there were marks on the ground. They looked like scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged into the house. The marks went to the door entrance, where they disappeared. Liam hesitated. Something inside him said to come back, but he couldn't. He needed to know what was going on. Suddenly, a loud sound broke the silence of the night. It was a dry thump, as if something had fallen on the floor inside the house. He froze, but soon hid behind a bush, afraid to be seen. The lights of the upper floor blinked. Through a crack in the curtain, Liam saw a figure pass by, a tall and thin shadow with movements that seemed wrong. It was almost as if the person were moving in slow motion. The sound of footsteps echoed, coming towards the back door. Liam held his breath, hoping not to be discovered. The handle rotated, but the door did not open. Instead, the steps moved away, and silence took over again. With his heart still beating, Liam ran back to his house. He knew something was wrong in that house, more wrong than he thought. He needed a plan, and perhaps courage, to find out what that silent neighbor was hiding. Liam couldn't sleep that night. His mind reproduced the image of that strange figure upstairs, its disjointed movements and the frightening sound of footsteps approaching the back door. For the first time, he wondered if he had gone too far. But the mystery consumed him. The next day, he decided that he needed to enter the house. Went back to the neighborhood hardware store and bought a small flashlight and a screwdriver, trying to look as casual as possible. He knew that if anyone found out, he would say he was just trying to solve a silly mystery. But his instinct said there was something much darker in that house. At midnight, armed with the flashlight, the screwdriver and a courage that could hardly justify, Liam crossed the yard again. The silence was oppressive, and the surrounding air seemed heavier as he approached the house. This time, he did not stop in the yard. With a quick movement of the screwdriver, forced the kitchen window to open and, with some difficulty, entered. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A mixture of mold, dust, and something metallic, almost like rust. The dim light of the lantern illuminated the kitchen, revealing an eerily empty room. There were no plates, glasses, or any sign of everyday life. Just an old table with faded chairs and marks on the floor that seemed to lead to the corridor. He followed the marks. The corridor was covered with shadows, and each step made the ground creak in a disturbing way. The walls were scratched, as if someone or something had repeatedly passed his hands on them. Suddenly, Liam heard a sound coming from upstairs. A low, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to repeat the same words. He could not understand what they were saying, but the sound increased as if something was slowly approaching. Climbing the stairs, with his muscles tense and heart racing, Liam pointed the flashlight forward, trying not to make a noise. At the top, he found a door ajar. Inside, there was a faint light flashing, like that of an old television. Carefully, he pushed the door. The room was small and seemed to be used as a kind of improvised workshop. There were tools scattered, but what caught his attention was a chair in the center of the room. Ties were attached to it, and the floor around it was covered with dark spots that he preferred not to examine closely. On the opposite wall was a large mirror covered with a black cloth. The whisper grew louder, and Liam noticed it coming from behind the mirror. With trembling hands, he approached and pulled the cloth. Behind the glass, there was no reflection of the room. The mirror showed something completely different. A dark, hazy environment where several indistinct figures seemed to move. Some of them hit the glass trying to cross, but were held by an invisible barrier. Liam stumbled backwards, but before he could run, he heard footsteps in the corridor. Slowly, the same tall and thin figure he had seen from the window appeared at the door. Now, in the dim light, he could see more details. His face looked deformed, his eyes deep and empty, and his arms too long to be human. "You shouldn't be here," the thing said in a hoarse, dragged voice. Liam tried to run away, but the figure reached him in seconds, holding him with an inhuman force. He screamed, but the sound was muffled by the rising whisper that now echoed throughout the house. The mirror began to vibrate, and Liam saw the figures on the other side shaking violently. In a last impulse of despair, he managed to free himself, knocking the figure down on the ground. Ran up the stairs and out the front door, feeling the cold night air enveloping his face. He did not stop until he arrived home, locking the door behind him and throwing himself on the couch, panting. But as he tried to calm down, he noticed something. The whisper was still there, low, but present, as if it had followed him out of the house. In the days that followed, Liam avoided even looking at the house next door. He closed the curtains of the room, turned off the alarm phone to not wake up during the night, and tried as much as possible to pretend that nothing had happened. However, the whisper continued. It was low, like a distant buzz, but it was always there when he was alone in his room, when he passed through the hall, even when he slept. The sound seemed to come from inside his head, repeating words he could not decipher. "Clara noticed your change in behavior. You look weird, Liam. You keep looking at the front door, and you have horrible dark circles. Is everything okay?" He did not know how to explain to his sister what he had seen. No one would believe him, and worse, he himself did not know if he was losing his sanity. One night, while trying to ignore the constant noise, heard a sound coming from the yard. Something light, like steps on the grass. He froze, trying to convince himself that it was just the wind or an animal. But then he heard the same scratching sound he had noticed the first time he was near his neighbor's house. Liam ran to the window of the room, peeking through the curtain's crack. The yard was dark, but he saw something. A tall, thin shadow standing in the fence separating the houses. He backed away, trying not to make any noise, but the shadow seemed to notice his presence. She raised what appeared to be a hand, long and deformed, and pointed directly at the window. The whisper in his head became louder. Now he understood the words. "You opened the door. You set them free." The shadow moved away, disappearing into darkness. But even after it disappeared, the whisper continued. That night, Liam did not sleep. He tried to tell his mother what he had seen, but she thought it was a figment of his imagination. Clara, worried, suggested that he talk to someone, but Liam knew that no therapist could help him. Not knowing what to do, he decided to investigate on his own. He searched the internet for local legends, ancient crimes, anything that could explain what was in that house. That's when he found something. A news story from 15 years ago about the former resident. The man was a recluse, known to never leave the house. He had been found dead in the upstairs room, trapped in a chair. The police identified him as a supposed medium who performed rituals to communicate with the world of the dead. When he died, reports of strange activities in the house arose, but the story was quickly forgotten. Liam felt a shiver run through his spine. He remembered the mirror the figure stuck behind the glass. That was not a simple mirror, it was a portal, and now something had escaped. That night, as he lay down, he heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the light steps of Clara or her mother, but heavy, dragged, just like those that had heard in the neighbor's house. He stood up slowly, trying not to make noise. When he opened the bedroom door, the hallway was empty, but the whisper was deafening now, filling his mind with a chorus of voices. At the end of the hall, he saw something. The thin and deformed figure was there, standing, looking directly at him. "You brought it here," the thing said, the voice reverberating as if it came from another world. Liam tried to run, but felt the ground under his feet crumble. The corridor disappeared, and he found himself surrounded by the same mist he saw in the mirror. Indistinct figures approached, their arms extended, touching him, pulling him into that darkness. The next morning, Clara knocked on Liam's door, calling him for breakfast. When he didn't answer, she opened the door. The room was empty. Only the open window and a low sound, like a whisper, filled the space. Liam was never seen again. The house next door was put up for sale months later, but no one dared to buy it. And sometimes at night, some neighbors swear to hear footsteps and whispers coming from inside it, and strangely enough, from the Harris's house as well.